On August 12, 1977, the Space Shuttle Enterprise made its very first free flight, meaning that for the first time it was cut loose from its Boeing 747 Shuttle Carrier Aircraft and allowed to fly on its own. I was 13 years old, and I was utterly fascinated by this spaceship that looked to me to be the future of humanity. And the Space Shuttle program would continue to make free flights for another 34 years until 2011, when on July 21st, the Space Shuttle Atlantis completed the last mission of the Space Shuttle program. It's really hard for me to wrap my mind around the fact that this vehicle that I saw in my lifetime to be the future of humanity is now history. That's almost as ironic as the fact that the very first space shuttle, Enterprise, never made it into space.
The crew of Apollo 17 splashed down on December 19th, 1972, and that was the last time that humans walked on the moon. It wasn't supposed to be. As late as 1969, at the time of the Apollo 11 mission, NASA had planned 9 more missions to the moon. But on January 4th, 1970, NASA issued a stop work order canceling preparations for Apollo 20, essentially ending that mission. Dr. John M. Logsdon, former director of George Washington University's Space Policy Institute, wrote on the website of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum in 2025. NASA decided that using one of the existing Saturn V's for constructing and launching the experimental space station Skylab had higher priority than one more lunar landing mission. Then in April, much went wrong with Apollo 13. Sending astronauts to the moon was a risky game, and NASA administrators had to consider future plans. President Kennedy's goal, as he stated in a speech to Congress on May 25, 1961, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth, had been accomplished. So where did more moon landing missions fit in? On September 2nd, 1970, NASA announced the termination of plans for Apollos 18 and 19. Apollo 17 would be the last. It was a disappointment to many scientists who had been, Logsdon writes, eagerly awaiting the enhanced scientific capabilities of the final 3 Apollo missions. But when astronauts Gene Cernan, Harrison Schmitt, and Ronald Evans splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, there was a collective feeling that an extraordinary time in human history had just ended. But also a lingering question. What was next? In fact, we already knew. On January 5th, 1972, 11 months before Apollo 17 blasted off, President Nixon had released a statement. I have decided today that the United States should proceed at once with the development of an entirely new type of space transportation system designed to help transform the space frontier of the 1970s into familiar territory, easily accessible for human endeavor in the 1980s and 90s. The system will center on a space vehicle that can shuttle repeatedly from Earth to orbit and back. It will revolutionize transportation into near space by routinizing it. Nixon had not, and maybe offered the same level of rhetorical flourish as Kennedy had when he said, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things not because they are easy, but because they are hard." But he did offer a hopeful vision. At the end of his statement, quoting Oliver Wendell Holmes, "We must sail sometimes with the wind and sometimes against it. But we must sail and not drift, nor lie at anchor." NASA Administrator James C. Fletcher called Nixon's decision an historic step in the nation's space program. Both presidents, of course, were using rhetoric to apply a pretty face to politics. For all of JFK's talk about the conquest of space being an opportunity for peaceful cooperation, the Apollo program was the culmination of a space race that was more about missiles than science, and more about ideological competition than cooperation. The stakes were such that Kennedy was willing to spend whatever it took to win that race. Nixon's program to transform the space frontier was from the rather opposite direction. Logsdon notes that Nixon had cut NASA's 1970 budget by 15%, and in a space policy statement released in March 1970, President Nixon said that space expenditures must take their proper place within a rigorous system of national priorities. NASA's decision to pursue the Space Shuttle program in the face of budgetary and political realities made sense. Dr. Thomas Heppenheimer, an associate fellow of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, wrote in the introduction to NASA's official history of the Space Shuttle program, published in 1999, that after Apollo, NASA Administrator Thomas Paine led a push for a future in space that promised to be expansive. He aimed at nothing less than a piloted expedition to Mars, propelled by nuclear rocket engines that were already in development. En route to Mars, he expected to build space stations and large space bases. The vision was, of course, not only expansive, it was expensive. But NASA Administrator James C. Fletcher, appointed by Nixon in April of 1971, was facing entirely different constraints. The expansive vision had to be, well, much less so. What was left? Heppenheimer explains that Paine's vision, with all its space stations, had included, almost as an afterthought, a space shuttle to provide low cost flight to these orbiting facilities. After the initial budget cuts following the successful Apollo 11 mission, NASA had scaled back plans, but was still interested in developing both the shuttle program and the space station program simultaneously. But the president and Congress were still skeptical of the cost. The programs faced what Heppenheimer describes as a near death experience, as both the House and Senate came close to killing the programs in 1970. NASA pivoted to prioritize the shuttle program. That makes sense. The station would essentially require the shuttle program. With budgets limited, it made sense to build the shuttle first. But more importantly, in the political climate where NASA needed friends on Capitol Hill, the space shuttle had garnered the attention of the military. The Air Force saw the shuttle program as a low cost way to launch reconnaissance and other military satellites. Heppenheimer notes an irony. Through the 1960s, the Air Force had sought and failed to receive funding for programs to put military astronauts in space. Now they were being asked to provide political support for a NASA program that would allow them to do just that. In fact, the program being funded through NASA meant, Heppenheimer writes, that the Air Force would receive the shuttle on a silver platter. Air Force support shifted the conversation and quelled opposition on Capitol Hill. But then the program had to face the Office of Management and Budget, which at first demanded that the project be scaled back. That would reduce its cost, but Heppenheimer notes it would have significantly less capability than the Air Force wanted. But the same administration that had argued that space expenditures must take their proper place within a rigorous system of national priorities came to the program's rescue. Both Nixon and George Shultz, director of the Office of Management and Budget, decided that, Heppenheimer writes, since the shuttle was to serve the entire nation, it should have the full capability for which NASA hoped and the Air Force demanded. The consequence, Heppenheimer concludes, was the space shuttle as we know it today. There was a lengthy study and evaluation process for what was at the time called the Integral Launch and Reentry Vehicle, or ILRV. The first contracts for design, study, and proposal had been awarded all the way back in 1968. Culmination of this process was summarized by NASA's Space Task Group in a report entitled The Post-Apollo Space Program, Directions for the Future, published in September of 1969. The report offered multiple potential designs, as Matthew Williams noted on the website Universe Today in 2022. Here's an interesting and little-known fact. The actual design of the space shuttle could have been entirely different. There were many discussions of configurations and materials for both the orbiter and the boosters, but Heppenheimer notes in a chapter entitled A Shuttle to Fit the Budget, by mid-1971, a convergence among contractors was occurring for the orbiter design. The design would have 3 boost engines, called SSME for Space Shuttle Main Engines, and 2 orbital maneuvering systems, or OMS engines, that would allow the shuttle to maneuver. Fuel for the SSMEs would come from the tank of the external launch vehicle, while the fuel tank for the OMS engines would be under the vehicle's belly. The engines were for the purpose of getting the vehicle into orbit and maneuvering once it got there, but it would return home without the help of the engines, essentially a very large glider. It would have a swept wing configuration and a 15 by 60 foot cargo bay. On July 26, 1972, in between the April Apollo 16 mission and the December Apollo 17 mission, NASA awarded a contract to the Space Division of North American Rockwell Corporation, which had built the command and service modules for the 11 Apollo missions. For, NASA explained in an announcement, design and production of a triangle wing vehicle, the so-called orbiter, that will carry the 4-man crew plus 6 or more scientists into Earth orbit. This new vehicle was designated Orbital Vehicle, or OV-101. Construction of OV-101 began on June 4, 1974 at Rockwell's plant in Downey, California. OV-101 was initially built to conduct approach and landing tests to, NASA explains on its webpage, verify the vehicle's aerodynamic characteristics. These tests would be conducted in the atmosphere, so there was no need for the SSMEs or OMS pods. But much more. Some parts were still being developed, others were too expensive. All of those were unnecessary for the limited test roll. A fact sheet on the website Spaceline, operated by veteran space journalist Cliff Lethbridge, explained, for example, the payload bay contained no mounting hardware for cargo packages, and the payload bay door contained no hydraulic mechanisms to allow it to open and close. The vehicle lacked the guidance system that would be used in spaceflight. It didn't include some windows that would be incorporated into the operational space shuttles. The flight deck controls were simpler. Power was provided by fuel cells, much smaller than those that would be used in operational flight. The landing gear lacked a hydraulic system. The doors would instead be opened by explosive bolts, and the gear would be pulled down by gravity. Weight representative of the actual orbital flight would be represented by ballast. The thermal protection tiles that would protect the shuttle on orbital reentry were expensive and fragile, so to save cost, polyurethane foam was used as an ersatz replacement. Still, NASA expected, once the important tests on the vehicle design were completed, OV-101 was expected to be retrofitted for orbital flight. With assembly beginning in June of 1974, NASA expected the vehicle to leave the plant in 1976, the nation's bicentennial. In celebration, NASA planned to name OV-101 Constitution. But a certain vocal group of space enthusiasts had a different idea. The show Star Trek, set aboard the fictional spacecraft Enterprise, premiered September 8, 1966. It was not exactly a hit. The website Television Obscurities notes that a nationwide survey of 24 critics conducted by Television Magazine in 1966 found that only 5 considered Star Trek good, while 8 found it bad and 11 were indifferent. The show struggled in the ratings, but developed a loyal fan base. When rumors started to circulate that the show would be canceled after its second season, Television Obscurities notes the network received some 114,667 letters between December of 1967 and March of 1968, including 52,151 in February 1968 alone. The broadcaster reported that letters were sent by 2 governors, several mayors, and corporation executives, pleading for its return. The letter writing campaign succeeded in earning the show a 3rd season, albeit with a much reduced budget. But ratings were still lackluster, and the show was canceled in 1969. Ironically, the show last aired in June, only a month before Apollo 11 went, where no man had gone before. Popular Science magazine noted in 2025 that the show lived on in syndication. The first of many fan conventions that have come to represent Trekkie culture was held January 21st to 23rd, 1972, at the Statler Hilton in New York City, just 2 weeks after Nixon announced the shuttle program. Star Trek fans had already learned the power of a letter-writing campaign, and they went into action. By September of 1976, OV-101 was nearly completed, and NASA was ready to unveil the new ship. As a preview for the public, NASA Administrator James Fletcher was scheduled to present the president with a scale mock-up of the new shuttle. On September 3rd, Ford received a memorandum from William Goreg, his Deputy Chief of Staff for Economic Affairs, stating, Dr. Fletcher is not averse to the name Enterprise for the Space Shuttle, and I suggest that you ask that it be so named for the following reasons. NASA has received hundreds of thousands of letters from the space-oriented Star Trek group asking that the name Enterprise be given to the craft. This group comprises millions of individuals who are deeply interested in our space program. The name Enterprise is tied in with the system on which the nation's economic structure is built. Use of the name would provide a substantial human interest appeal to the rollout ceremonies scheduled for this month in California, where the aeronautical industry is of vital importance. Fletcher met with Ford on September 8, 1976, which NASA notes was coincidentally the 10th anniversary of the debut of the original Star Trek TV show on NBC. At the meeting, Ford suggested the name Enterprise to Fletcher, saying it is a distinguished name in American naval history, with a long tradition of courage and endurance. It is also a name familiar to millions of faithful followers of the science fiction television program Star Trek. To explore the frontiers of space, there is no better ship than the Space Shuttle, and no better name for that ship than the Enterprise. On September 17th, the new shuttle made its public debut in Palmdale, California, in front of 600 invited guests and 185 media representatives. The name Enterprise was proudly painted on its side. Among the invited guests were several members of the TV series cast, as well as series creator Gene Roddenberry. Shuttles would in generally be transported aboard a modified Boeing 747 aircraft called a Shuttle Carrier Aircraft, or SCA. By the following February, Enterprise was ready to begin a series of 16 approach and landing tests, carried out in 4 phases. 3 of those phases would be while attached to the SCA, but the final phase would detach Enterprise. And piloted by astronaut and Air Force pilot Gordon Fullerton, with mission commander Fred Haynes, who had piloted the lunar module for Apollo 13. On August 12, 1977, Enterprise was detached from the SCA in flight and landed in the first ever free flight of the Space Shuttle program. The tests were critical to the Space Shuttle program. A NASA technical report noted the first free flight phase of the ALT program allowed shuttle pilots to explore the orbiter's low-speed flight and landing characteristics. The Enterprise provided realistic in-flight simulations of how subsequent space shuttles would be flown at the end of an orbital mission. The 5th free flight with the Enterprise landing on a concrete runway for the first time revealed a problem with the Space Shuttle flight control system that made it susceptible to pilot-induced oscillation, a potentially dangerous control problem. Further research using various aircraft led to correction of the problem before the first orbital test flight. The report concludes that the ALT program would provide experience that could not be gained from wind tunnel tests or simulations. But there was a problem. The first fully operational orbital shuttle, Columbia, had begun construction in March of 1975. During that construction, NASA implemented major design changes to reduce weight. These were not minor changes. Enterprise was to have been retrofitted to become the second fully capable orbital shuttle, but the new changes would have required completely dismantling Enterprise's airframe at immense cost. Rather than retrofitting Enterprise, an engineering model used to test design stresses called Test Article 99 was used to construct the new shuttle. As the test article did not have a complete airframe that would have to be dismantled, the conversion was more cost effective. Test Article 99 would become the shuttle Challenger. The 5 free flights of the ALT program would be the only time that Enterprise flew solo, not attached to the SCA. Enterprise continued to be used for testing. In 1978, it was used for ground vibration tests. Conducted at Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, Enterprise was, for the first time in the shuttle program history, mated with an external tank and solid rocket boosters. Ground vibration testing was done to confirm the structural integrity of the entire launch stack. In 1979, Enterprise was transported to Florida to test Launchpad 39A, the vehicle assembly building and ground processing equipment, before Columbia arrived for the first Space Transport System, or STS, mission. In 1984 and 85, Enterprise was used by the Air Force in California to do fit checks for planned military shuttle launches from the West Coast. Enterprise was used by NASA for exhibitions. NASA sent Enterprise on a European tour in 1983 with stops in the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, and France for the annual Paris Air Show. Between April and November of 1984, Enterprise was placed on public display in the U.S. Pavilion of the World's Fair in New Orleans. In 1985, NASA transferred ownership of Enterprise to the Smithsonian Institution, and from 1985 to 2011, Enterprise was displayed by the institution in Washington, D.C. Even then, though, the NASA website explains, NASA found practical use for the venerable Enterprise. In 1987, the agency was concerned about how to handle an orbiter returning from space should it suffer a brake failure. To test the efficacy of an arresting barrier, workers slowly winched Enterprise into a landing barrier that they had set up to see if the vehicle suffered any damage. Later that same year, NASA used Enterprise to test various crew bailout procedures being developed in the wake of the Challenger accident. In 1990, experimenters used Enterprise's cockpit windows to test mount an antenna for the Shuttle Amateur Radio experiment, as no other orbiters were available. After the Shuttle Challenger disaster in 1986, NASA briefly considered bringing Enterprise out of retirement and retrofitting it as a replacement. However, NASA decided that building a replacement from structural spare parts was more cost-effective. Those parts would become the Shuttle Endeavour. In the wake of the Columbia disaster in 2003, NASA notes that investigators borrowed Enterprise's left landing gear door and part of the port wing for foam impact tests. The tests provided solid evidence that foam strike was the cause of the accident.
Despite the program's two disasters, which are all too memorable for those of us who lived through the Space Shuttle era, the Space Shuttle program successfully conducted 133 safe landings. A NASA technical report concludes that, without question, Enterprise and the ALT program paved the way for this remarkable record of success. In 2011, when the Space Shuttle program was discontinued, NASA announced that the Space Shuttle Discovery would replace the Enterprise at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. The ownership of Enterprise was transferred to the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum complex in New York City. Today, you can visit Enterprise at Pier 86 at West 46th Street and 12th Avenue, New York City, New York. In 2013, as one final honor, or maybe insult, to those of us who once saw the Space Shuttle program as the future, the Space Shuttle Enterprise was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.